Welcome to the next episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of casual conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. Remember, in these conversations we are speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Dr. Juliette McIntyre, Senior Lecturer in Law at Adelaide University, and today we are coming together to remember the Right Honourable Sir Kenneth Keith, ONZ KBE PC KC, who has died aged 88 on the 13th of May 2026. Joining me today is Bill Campbell, Honorary Professor at ANU and at various points General Counsel, International Law and Head of the Office of International Law in the Federal Attorney General's Department between about 1996 and 2018. Dr. Penelope Ridings, currently a member of the International Law Commission for the 2023 to 2027 term, and Anne Hertogen, Associate Professor at the University of Auckland Faculty of Law. We are going to share stories of Sir Kenneth's life in law, to quote the title of his bibliography, reflect on his legacy and consider how Sir Kenneth, or Ken as I might refer to him from now on, how his approach to international legal practice might guide us all into the future. So welcome everyone to the pod. Of course, we must begin with our first question. What's your drink?
Well, that's the big question, of course. Even my husband, who's not an international lawyer, asked me this morning, what is your drink? So I had to think quite carefully about that. And well, normally I would say a Lindemans framboise, true to my Belgian roots. But since tomorrow is a work day and I have to chair a PhD oral exam in the morning, I'm sticking to a herbal tea.
Very sensible.
That's very sensible of you, Anne. My drink tends to be a wine. So either a nice South Island Pinot Noir or maybe an Italian Pinot Grigio. So that would be my choice.
Lovely. And I must say, Penny's joining us from Geneva. So it's 9 a.m. So wine is probably not quite on the cards right this minute, but maybe later. And Bill?
I always enjoy a beer, and my favorite beer is a Budovar Czech lager, and you can get it in non-alcoholic or alcoholic forms, but I prefer the former.
Oh, I've never had one of those. I'll have to try it.
Very good.
Oh, see now, and speaking of good quality New Zealand Pinot Noirs, I looked for one, but unfortunately my collection is lacking, so I'm just having a fairly bog standard Australian Shiraz. But never mind, the thought was there. Now look. It's fair to say that Sir Kenneth, or Ken, had a very expansive career. He was a member of the International Court of Justice, of course, between 2006 and 2015. He was earlier a judge of the New Zealand Court of Appeal and Supreme Court between 1996 and 2006, and also a judge of appeal in Samoa, the Cook Islands, and other Pacific Island countries, as well as a member of various arbitration tribunals. On top of this, he was a law commissioner in New Zealand, a law faculty member at the Victoria University of Wellington, and a member of the legal offices of the United Nations and the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there's every chance someone has come across him at some point in their careers. So guests, what was your first or perhaps most memorable encounter with Sir Kenneth, and when and where did it take place?
Well,
So
I could
maybe
start. Or you start, Penny.
I was going to say I'll start because I probably have known Ken the longest, because when he was Dean of the Victoria Law School, I was a very junior lecturer at Auckland Law School. And in those days, we had something called moderation, where a group of us would go down from one university to another. So I was included in the moderation, and I went down to Victoria University, met Ken, as he was then, and also Robert Quentin Baxter, Jeffrey Palmer. And so I was moderating their courses. So you can imagine me as a very junior sort of lecturer. But what was really nice about it is that Ken was just so welcoming. He never made any comment about how young I was, treated me with respect. And I just always feel that was a really good example of what he was like as a person.
That's a wonderful story. Bill?
Well, mine's somewhat similar. Look, I first met Ken at the what were then the international law weekends that were held in Australia prior to ANZL coming into being. In fact, they were started by Sir Ellie Louterpack. And I had much the same experience as Penny did because despite his even then sort of considerable achievements, Sir Ken was really approachable, and he was more than willing to have a conversation with a young and inexperienced legal officer, such as myself. But it's difficult to sort of narrow down the most memorable encounter that I had with Ken. We did appear before him on a number of occasions in courts and tribunals, and the first one was I think in Washington in the year 2000 at ICSID in the Southern Bluefin tuna case. And I think he distinguished himself in two ways in that case. The first was that he sought to have a real dialogue with.
Unfortunately, we're having a tech moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Anne to step in while Bill waits for his internet connection to come back. So, Anne, your memorable moment with Sir Ken.
Yes, so I only arrived in New Zealand 20 years ago, and my first encounter with Sir Ken, who was definitely already Sir Ken at that point, was during his time at the ICJ when he gave a guest lecture to students in Auckland. So that must have been probably 2008 or 2009. My most memorable encounter, and if I remember correctly, also probably my last in-person one, was a few years ago. I was in the middle of marking first-year papers at home, and I received an email shortly before 11 a.m. Dear Anne, I'm in Auckland. Would it be possible to catch up with you, preferably this morning, to hear how you're going, perhaps including lunch? So as one does when Sir Ken emails you, you drop everything and you get out of your track pants and you change into something more appropriate when one is to meet Sir. And so I rushed into the city only to realize that I left my phone, my wallet, everything at home. So luckily, my friend and colleague, Professor McLean, who is herself a close friend of Sir Ken, was around, and I went to her and said, look, I'm going to have lunch with Sir Ken. I don't have any money. So she luckily had $20 on her, which still was not a lot to have lunch with at the lovely bistro that he had picked. So my rather meek conversation opener was, I'm very sorry, but I'm not going to be able to eat very much because I forgot my money. At which point he just generously laughed and said, of course, it was his invitation and I could eat whatever I wanted. So we had a very lovely lunch together at that point and discussed all sorts of international law issues, as well as kind of him reflecting on his career, which at that point he was very slowly but certainly wrapping up. And it's certainly a lunch that I will not quickly forget.
That's lovely. Honestly, I think he's one of those people that I've never heard anyone say a bad word about. He's such a lovely and generous soul. Now, Bill, unfortunately, we lost you there for a moment, but you're back in the room. So, yes, so we got up to you were appearing before him in
the second thing I wanted to say arising out of that case was that he was the only one to come to the right decision in that case. He was in a minority of one. And we knew that we'd lost the case when we heard that Ken was in a minority of one. And the tribunal found that it didn't have jurisdiction, and he said they did have jurisdiction. But as it turns out, over the ensuing years, the opinion of Ken in that case came to be accepted by other international courts and tribunals, including in the South China Sea arbitration. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I didn't realize the direct connection there. I will say there was a lot of vigorous nodding when we said Sir Ken was the one who reached the right conclusion there. But yeah, I didn't realize the impact that minority decision had. And look, actually, I think that leads really nicely into my next question, which I'll direct to you, Bill, in the first instance, which is that Sir Ken was a judge of quite significant experience prior to his appointment to the International Court of Justice or prior to moving into international law disputes in general. And this isn't always the case. So, would you say that it was a benefit to him directly? Do we see that in the way that he writes his judgments? And, as a more general sort of issue, should international court judges be drawn from national judiciaries? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think serving in a national judiciary is very helpful. And obviously, as you say, you could see it in the way he wrote his judgments in the International Court of Justice and judgments more generally. And I think serving in the national judiciary is particularly helpful, if not essential, in international criminal tribunals, including the ICC. And good examples of that are a couple of Australian ones would be Justice Hunt and Justice Kevin Parker, who served on a criminal court. But I'm not sure it should be a deciding factor in an appointment to the International Court of Justice. A few judges have been elected to the ICJ based on their sort of domestic judicial experience alone, but there are some other very important factors which I think Ken just had in spades, actually, and they include significant expertise in international law and its practice, sitting on and appearing before international courts and tribunals prior to going on the ICJ, and very importantly, collegiality, because you've got to get on with the other members of the court. That's not to underestimate the value of a period of practice in domestic law or on a domestic court. And James Crawford used to say, in fact, that a period of practice in domestic law provides a good foundation for the practice of international law. That's what I'd say on the topic.
Mm. James always used to say to me, you got to be a good lawyer first before you can be a good
That's
international
right.
lawyer. Yeah. Penny, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
No, I totally agree that you need to be a good domestic lawyer before you're a good international lawyer. But I agree completely with what Bill has said. I think there is real value in having an experienced adjudicator on the court. There's things like knowledge of domestic law processes like judicial review, how to treat evidence, things like that, which are useful to transfer over. How to interpret your sort of interpretive techniques. Though different, it's useful to have that, but I would agree with Bill that the difference with Ken is that he had a very wide international career in international law. So he was an academic and a good academic. He was also, in his early days, a government official. He'd worked in the UN Secretariat, so he was a practitioner, appeared before courts, as Bill indicated. So he was a very well-rounded international lawyer. That doesn't come across very often. You don't get those kinds of people nowadays who have that real breadth of experience in basically everything. So he was different from many. So I would say that it's useful to have domestic adjudication experience, but it's not essential.
Yeah. Anne, your thoughts?
I generally agree with what Penny and Bill have mentioned already. And I think it's really important to realize that, yes, Ken was a really unique candidate for the ICJ. So a few years ago, I did a research project on New Zealand's international law judges, and I interviewed people who'd been involved with his campaign. And people described him as he was destined for the ICJ. And also someone mentioned, well, if we couldn't get a seat with Sir Ken, then who would we have been able to get a seat with, really? I think it was just that experience. It almost feels reductive to say that he was a national judge first, because he was appointed straight to the New Zealand Court of Appeals, but only in his late 50s. He had done so many other things before, and I think that mix of experience made that he brought a lot of skills, but also that he had a really wide network, and he was very widely well liked. And one of the tidbits that he mentioned to me when I interviewed him, and I thought was so crucial, or that really stuck with me in a way, was when he was at Harvard, took a seminar with Richard Baxter that also had in his class a certain Thomas Bergenthal. So imagine you had this seminar with three future ICJ judges there. And when he worked at the UN, he worked together with Hitsashi Owada, who then later overlapped with him at the ICJ. So even from a young age, it seems that sort of the call with the ICJ was already there.
That's so interesting. Yes, destined for the court, I think is a good way of expressing it. Now, look, we've touched briefly on the breadth of his career, and that leads me to my next question, which is that, of course, Sir Ken was also a law reform commissioner in New Zealand. He helped shape enduring work across a wide range of areas, things like accident compensation, legislation reforms, succession law. Now, Penny, you're a current commissioner, albeit for a quite different entity. But would you like to reflect on the role of law reform bodies? Why is this sort of work important, and what was Sir Ken's contribution in this field?
So I think it's interesting in reflecting on this, on your question, Juliette. Of course, Sir Ken was involved in the New Zealand Law Commission. I should also note that he was also involved way back in the early 1970s in the International Law Commission. He was actually secretary of the International Law Commission. And in reflecting on your question, it's useful to think of the similarities between the national and an international law reform body. So both undertake studies on discrete topics and provide recommendations. In the case of the New Zealand Law Commission, provides recommendations to government. In the case of the International Law Commission, to governments, plural, through the UN General Assembly. But both tend to work on their own work programs, but they have to take into account they have to consult on those work products in order to ensure that they have a wide audience. They also are subject to another sort of state that has to take those law reform efforts forward. So that's a reason why they have to consult widely. But it's in thinking what their usefulness is. I think the first thing is that they're independent and they provide expert advice. So those are two really, really crucial aspects of them. They're able to provide really in-depth research and sort of undertake that research outside both national and, in the case of the International Law Commission, global politics. So they're sort of apolitical in that respect. But at the same time, they have to understand the political nuances so that their law reform efforts are going to be productive. And I think that in the long term, it's useful to think about how they undertake recommendations looking at the big picture and the longer term, not just the every day-to-day work. And I think that that's what Sir Ken did in the work that he did for the New Zealand Law Commission. It was very almost like blue sky thinking. It was looking at the areas where there was a need for reform and developing an approach that was ultimately successful. So I think that is really what his legacy in the terms of law reform. But I'd be interested in the views of Bill and Anne on this as well.
Anne and Bill, fire away.
Look, I think the work of law reform commissions and on the international plane, the International Law Commission, their value is really beyond doubt. The outcomes in their reports have formed the basis of a lot of domestic and international law. I suppose on this, I wanted to mention that at the time of Ken Keith and James Crawford on their respective law reform commissions, in fact, overlap. So James was on the Law Reform Commission in Australia for a number of years and put out a number of reports which were very important, including on matters relating to international law, such as foreign state immunity. Have I been lost again?
No. Carry on. No, you're all good.
Okay. Foreign state immunity, and he did a report on Indigenous law, which is just a landmark report. But in his tribute to James in the Leiden Journal, Ken noted that he and James met quite frequently in their respective roles, and that was to their mutual benefit on the matters being considered by their commissions. And he also Ken referred to matters coming out of those domestic commissions even being mentioned in international courts and tribunals. So I think that's what I'd say on the subject. And also to note that James, of course, was on the International Law Commission at one stage and did some great reports there.
Anne?
Yeah, so as someone who, other than my PhD, wasn't actually educated in the New Zealand legal system, I find a law commission quite a fascinating institution. And I think actually all the work that I've seen come out of them, it's always high quality. I think there's definitely something to be said for a commission like that, where you have blue sky thinking, like Penny alluded to, and it's always well thought through. And you see with the legislation that comes out of these institutions, it's often enduring because it is so well worked out. And yeah, the only thing I wanted to add to that is that even during his time as a law commissioner, Sir Ken didn't fully leave international law aside, because I believe he's the main author of a report that was a New Zealand Guide to International Law and its Sources that came out just as he was leaving there. And there was work being done on treaty examination as well, before Parliament came up with its own solution.
Yes, and I love that you chose the word enduring, because that was going to be my word choice as well. I think it's a really this work is so influential to the development of law, both domestic and international. And look, my guests today are making my job incredibly easy, because not only are their answers lucid and interesting, but they also lead beautifully into my next question, because once again, Anne has pointed out that she was not educated in New Zealand. And that is why my next question is directed to her, because as someone who wasn't raised in the tradition of New Zealand common law, would you say that there is a distinctly New Zealand-ish, New Zealander approach to Kiwi approach to international law? How much did Sir Ken represent or pioneer that kind of an approach as someone who's stepped into this world? And as the first answer, what have you observed?
Yeah. So, is there a Kiwi approach to international law? Shall we coin it kale or something while we're at it? Well, I think, I'm going to be a little bit of a realist here. I think, like all other states, New Zealand's ultimately driven by its own interests, and that's visible in the areas that are important to New Zealand and also how it acts in international law. So I remember being very struck at my first ANZL in the late 2000s by just how many panels there were about fisheries, which, as someone who'd been interested in international law before I moved to New Zealand, I never realized there was so much international law just about fisheries. Law of the sea, yes, but fish. So that's one thing. But more importantly, I think how New Zealand as a state acts in relation to international law and really approach, I think it often presents itself, and it often is, I don't want to be too critical, as a very active supporter of the multilateral rules-based system, because, well, that's in the interest of New Zealand as a small state with limited resources and a small population. But at the same time, when the multilateral system brings us rules that maybe challenge us, we are, unlike most states around the world, maybe not always the model citizens that we like to say we are, we now being Kiwi. So I think of our initial reaction to UNDRIP as an example of that. I think just in general, I think the New Zealand's approach to international law is definitely different than about a century ago. And there's always been that international orientation, but historically, that international orientation had perhaps more of a different home in the British Empire rather than in the multilateral institutions of the later days. So, for example, under the PCIJ, we kind of had quite a strong initial opposition to the PCIJ's compulsory jurisdiction. And all of that, I think the approach has definitely changed a lot as the world changed since the 1960s. And I think Sir Ken would probably say that he was lucky to have lived through those times of great legal change, but I would certainly reply to that if I could, to say that his influence in shaping that openness and the change shouldn't really be downplayed. And we might come back to that influence and legacy later, but I think for now, if I were to say that there is a specific New Zealand approach to international law, it's primarily, I think, as a pragmatic bridge builder almost. New Zealand has a narrative that can help it connect with many other nations, and I think that was definitely something that was played out to New Zealand's advantage during the campaign for Sir Ken's seat at the ICJ. Like, it has, of course, the historical connection to England and through that to the broader Commonwealth. But then it's also based in the Pacific and has a connection to the Pacific states, including a few that are still officially part of the realm of New Zealand. So, and while we're big in the Pacific, we're kind of small on the world stage, which then helps us relate to other small nations or middle powers. And other things that are sort of maybe a bit unique is that, yes, we're a developed economy, but an economy that relies really heavily on agricultural exports. So that creates connections with other economies focused in that way. And I think New Zealand diplomats have always been quite adept at using these different aspects of New Zealand to its advantage and building relations and coalitions with different states. And I think that was also something that Sir Ken was really quite good at and really embodied himself as well. I think if you look at sort of just the title of his Liber Amicorum, or his Festschrift, or however you want to call it, it was really aptly entitled like, Seeing the World Whole. And he actively encouraged lawyers to see the world whole. And I think his career enabled him to do so. And I think it's an approach that kind of New Zealand, as in international law, has continued to do. And certainly our diplomats at MFAT are also still carrying on that legacy, I would say.
Yeah, Bill or Penny, do you have views on this? The Kale, the Kiwi approach to international law?
I don't know. Maybe I'll go and then Penny can respond to what I have to say. Look, of course, I'm not qualified to identify a distinctly New Zealand approach because, well, I'm not qualified to do that. But what I can say is that New Zealand and Australia have appeared in a few cases before courts and tribunals, either together or in tandem, and such as the nuclear test cases, the southern bluefin tuna case, and whaling cases. So what can I draw from those experiences? The first is that while some of the arguments put forward by each country in those cases might well differ, in most of those cases, every effort was made by both countries to ensure that the arguments were at least complementary. Now, an exception might be the nuclear test case. And Sir Kenneth pointed out that the New Zealand position in that case, that provisional measures were then binding, was completely undermined by an Australian answer to a judge's question. Also, New Zealand called for a much broader ban on nuclear testing than Australia called for in that case. So that I'll probably be criticised for saying this in Australia, but it might indicate that New Zealand has a more progressive approach in its arguments to international law than a lot of other countries, maybe even Australia. And I think to a degree that observation was confirmed by the New Zealand arguments that they actually put in the whaling case, which differed from the arguments put forward by Australia. I'll finish by saying this. So, I think I would see New Zealand as taking a progressive approach to international law. But added to that is, I should say this, there is a degree of contestability between Australia and New Zealand on matters of international law. I say that in one sense, give an example. The first annual meeting after the favourable decision in the ICJ case, in which, of course, Sir Ken was in the majority, there was a vigorous discussion at Ansell about whether Australia or New Zealand's arguments actually won the whaling case. I don't know whether you were there, Penny, at the time. Thankfully, it didn't come to any conclusion, that argument, other than somebody saying, no, it was Justin Gleeson's cross-examination of Lars Wallow that won the case. It was a good cross. I'll leave it there.
I'd like to think it was my memo that I wrote James right back at the start of the case. That was the turning point. Maybe not. Penny.
So I'm glad I came after Bill and Dan. So yes, there was Justin Gleeson's cross-examination was definitely something to observe. But I agree with both of you, and so looking from a New Zealand perspective first, I agree with Anne that because we're a small state, we're very outward looking. So we're surrounded by water. And so that's why law of the sea and fisheries is so important to us. But it's because we're stuck down geographically at the end of the world, basically. And it takes us a long time to get anywhere out of New Zealand. We need to cooperate with others in order to get our views across. We have no power. We have little power. I don't think we have no power, but we have little power. So we have to use other kinds of influence. And we have to try to form a consensus. And I liked your word, bridge builder, because I think that is right. As a former official, that was what New Zealand officials do try to do in terms of try to build bridges to find ways through. I think when it comes to Ken, he displayed all that, but he was very pragmatic and very sensible. So he had not only a collaborative side to him, so he was very collaborative, but he could always see a way forward. But what was also interesting is that he knew his own mind. So he was not prepared to, go along with a majority when he did not agree with them. And so we find that in his in Southern Bluefin Tuna in particular, but also in Rainbow Warrior arbitration. So those are really good indications that he definitely knew his own mind. And I think that is also true of New Zealand international lawyers generally. And I think this brings up what Bill was saying about we don't always see eye to eye. And it's true. We don't always see eye to eye. But at the same time as trying to collaborate with others, we also do know our own minds. I think that New Zealanders, as a result, though, do tend to be a bit more progressive in our approach to international law. And in a way, it's because we try to think outside the box. And so in order to find solutions, sometimes it's necessary to, go a little beyond your comfort zone. And I think it's that seems to show a kind of progressive approach to international law. But I will leave it there because I think that Sir Ken actually encompassed all of that, coming from a small state, but also being very humble in the approach that he took to life. So I will finish there.
Wonderful. And look, I guess we can now maybe turn to taking a step back and looking at Sir Ken's broader career and things that we can potentially learn from that for younger lawyers, academics as well. Because as we've mentioned, his career had this enormous breadth. And, maybe it's emblematic of a different era, one in which it was possible to be a truly generalist international lawyer. And so I might ask, do you think is such a thing still possible in today's world? Can we aspire to have a career that emulates Sir Ken's? Not that I would ever be so arrogant to suggest such a thing, but or is it, nowadays, do we need to cultivate a more specialist field of expertise in order to succeed? What kind of career advice can we learn from Sir Ken? Anyone, go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to start, and just to say that, as you just said, I think the breadth and depth of Ken's career in the law, more generally, I think it's shared by very few people, very few indeed. And amongst other things, he was a true generalist international lawyer. And in my view, that's a career that remains possible and still retains its value today, myself. I suppose, to me, the best career is that of a generalist international lawyer, combined with an interest in particular areas of international law. And that's sort of reflected in the terminology and sort of interest groups. That said, I think there is a trend towards specialisation in particular areas. One example being international trade law. But I certainly don't, even in that field, I don't think specialisation in that field is necessary to succeed in that field. So I'm all in favour of international lawyers being generalists. Sometimes I think it's essential that they are. That's what I'll say.
So it's interesting. I agree with you, Bill. I think that it is possible still to be a generalist international lawyer. And in fact, I think that you need to have the solid foundation of general international law before you can even specialize in particular areas. So it's important, therefore, to be a generalist. I'm often asked by young lawyers, when should I specialize? Because they see nowadays that there's a lot of specialization, and people are extremely knowledgeable in a very narrow field. And that's partly because of the huge growth in materials in specialized subjects. So it's therefore very hard to be across a number of different subjects, because there's so much reading on any one issue, like climate change or like international trade, that it's sometimes very difficult to be across them all. But nevertheless, I think that if you've got a solid grounding in general international law, state responsibility, treaty interpretation, these very basic international law precepts, but at the same time have an understanding across which is a true generalist, have an understanding across a range of different fields. I think nowadays you can't really be even a generalist without having some degree of knowledge about international criminal law, or some degree of knowledge about law of the sea. So even as a generalist, you still need to have an understanding across a whole range of different fields. But I think that if you want to you can be a generalist and then highlight particular areas that you really want to be interested in and study more. And that's what I advise some young students who come to me, that don't specialize too early. Be a good generalist first. You can use those skills later in your specialization. But I'd be interested in your views, Anne.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised that question, Juliette, because actually in an email a few years ago to me, Sir Ken wrote that he was concerned about over-specialization, and obviously he was the ultimate generalist public lawyer, I would say, domestic law and international law. I think, and I also hope, that we can still be generalist international lawyers, because I think we do need to be generalists, but the pressure to specialize there it's definitely there. I mean, Penny already alluded to the fact just how much literature there is on there. I mean, Penny has just produced a lovely report on due diligence. I've been doing some work on that as well in the years, and just the sheer volume of work that exists on that particular term is staggering in a way. And I think definitely for legal academics, the pressure to specialize is definitely there, because, well, we have to keep up with all the developments alongside teaching, alongside service obligations. So sometimes you feel like you cannot be a generalist anymore, or if you are a generalist, your understanding of the field will be so shallow that you're not really capable of doing anything novel anymore. And in a way, that's a shame. I try to balance both of them, but it's certainly not easy. But I fully agree that if you are at the start of your career, you need to make sure that you've got that basic foundation and that you know all that, because it ties everything together, all the various areas. And then you can indeed start looking at trade law, or within trade law at a very specific subset. But it's always important to remember that generalist foundation. And I think certainly if anyone specifically from New Zealand is listening, I think certainly at MFAT, for example, lawyers seem to be moving between areas constantly, to keep that foundation alive and fresh.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you. And now, look, we have reached the end of the episode. And normally, when we wrap up Call to the Bar, we like to ask our guests questions about escape routes or cooking. But today, in honor of Sir Ken, I would like to ask you about his legacy. If you could summarize it briefly, what do you think was his most enduring contribution, be that to international law or to domestic New Zealand law or to international law in New Zealand? How will you remember him? Anyone, go ahead.
I don't mind. I can go ahead.
Go, Bill.
Look, of course, I'm not, I don't have a great deal of knowledge about what he did within New Zealand. I've seen a lot of descriptions of it, and it seems terrific. But I think the most enduring contribution was the contribution he made while he was on the International Court of Justice. On my count, he participated in almost 25 cases, if not 25, including 2 as ad hoc judge and also in 2 advisory opinions, including the Kosovo advisory opinion, in which he gave a separate opinion. And he did, I'm not sure how many of the actual principal judgments of the ICJ, the majority judgments, he was involved in drafting, but on my count, he gave 10 separate dissenting or declaratory opinions, which addressed a number of important and substantive procedural issues, and also, as alluded to by Penny, where he disagreed with something that was being said by the court, he made it known that he disagreed with it. But in his separate or dissenting or declaratory opinions, he addressed a number of important issues, such as intent as an element of genocide, which is quite current at the moment, what amounts to complicity in the crime of genocide, the principles of international law supporting sovereign immunity, and also the discretion of the court to refuse to give an advisory opinion where the requesting organ didn't have a sufficient interest in the subject matter. They're just a few of the issues that he raised in his separate opinions. I just wanted to finalise by saying, how I remember him really. I watched his funeral, which was just a very good funeral. But the one thing that struck me out of that was the revelation that when Sir Ken was asked his occupation, he always answered public servant. And that's in the broader sense of the term. And in my view, he was a true public servant in the broader sense of the term. He was a fine lawyer and a fine person, as has been alluded to, a fine person more generally. And that's how I'll remember him.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, so I only got to know him after he returned to New Zealand from the ICJ, in many ways. So, and I'd like to take a slightly different approach to your question that ties into our earlier discussion and also your recent episode with Mike Kirby and Chris Ward, and that's his contribution to the position of international law in New Zealand, domestic law, because he made a huge contribution there in a way that probably only he could have done. And I was reading again his autobiography, and he writes there how he became aware only after his studies how law is often made elsewhere, and that kind of became an enduring theme of his work. So even as a young academic, he started to write about the relationship between international and domestic law. And then later on in his judicial work, he really cracked open the dualist system and gave a much broader profile to international law in New Zealand domestic law. And again, you kind of see that theme of seeing the world whole from his Festschrift come back. So he really strongly argued in favor of a very holistic approach between domestic and international law. And he really embodied that in his career, where he really moved very seamlessly between both. And yeah, I will really remember him as someone who was indeed seeing the world whole, and he had an amazing ability of drawing connections, of synthesizing information. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of international law literature, and almost every discussion that you had when you say you were discussing a brief idea you were working on, he would say, oh, well, so in 1972, Jennings wrote an article that discussed this very point. I think it was on page 10. You should really look at that. And I think that also just embodied his generosity, not just of that lunch, but it's also the generosity of spirit. And it's certainly something that I experienced quite strongly in the last decade when I got to know him. He could easily have discounted a newcomer like me, as, oh, well, who is this? What is she doing here? But he took a genuine interest in my work, and he also sort of asked me sometimes to give comments on his own writing and trusted me with that, which I thought was kind of very welcoming and generous of him to sort of ask for feedback from little old me. So I definitely will remember his generosity, open-mindedness, and just welcoming nature very strongly.
Feeling quite emotional now. Penny.
So I'm very glad that I have come after Bill and Anne, because you both identified the enduring legacy of Ken, and both in the international sphere, but also in the domestic sphere. So I will not talk about his legacy. I'll talk more about how I remember him and what I take from him and his life. You've already mentioned it, Anne, in terms of his kindness and his consideration, especially to young scholars. I had people coming up to me and say that he was always so good. He would always ask me how my research was going. He was always interested in my research, and he was always very considerate to young people. And his knowledge was just so incredible. He would refer to things so just like you described, and he would describe things and say, oh yeah, somebody wrote something about this, and he did the same to me, sending me some things that he'd written to ask for feedback. That was not necessary, but so kind. So I think that it's how we remember him as a person, which I think we will all take home. But I'm going to tell a little story here. So last year I was at the Peace Palace, and I was shown around the grounds of the Peace Palace. And there was a po, a statue, a Maori statue, and it had been donated by Sir Ken and Lady Jocelyn. And on it was the words, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, in Maori. So that comes from a Maori proverb, which is, he ahe te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tanaka, he tangata. It basically says, what is the most important thing in the world? It's people, it's people, it's people. So his legacy stands in the Peace Palace grounds, in beautiful grounds. This proverb basically means that what is important is people, relationships with people, and that is what is most important in the world. And it is not a New Zealand perspective, it is a world perspective. So that's how I will remember him. And there is a legacy of him sitting in the Peace Palace grounds. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit the Peace Palace, go have a look in the grounds and try to find this this statue.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm outright crying now. So thank you so much for that beautiful story, Penny. For our guests who thank you so much for joining me today to share these wonderful memories and and learnings from Sir Ken's legacy. For our listeners, of course, Sir Ken did write a wonderful memoir, Without Fear or Favour, A Life in Law. We'll pop it in the show notes for you. Would highly recommend that as a read. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.